Today, the big news in the fighting in Ukraine is about what is happening on the northern front lines, where the Russians have the initiative. There are reports of the Russians about to make a breakthrough and perhaps capturing an important village, Sinkova. I will come to that shortly. Before I do that, and before I touch on the implications of this important news, I would like to first address the questions, the summaries of what's going on the southern battlefronts, the southern and eastern battlefronts, where Ukraine persists with its offensive. And in fact, there have been many more reports, but they all tell us the same story as the ones that we have been hearing over the last few weeks, of a Ukrainian offensive that is basically stuck, which is not able any longer to maintain advances. And I think the first thing to do is I will go to a report by Denis Pushilin. This is in TASS. Denis Pushilin is the acting head of the Donetsk regional government. He's obviously a Russian official, so one has to accept his biases, his own views, but overall I think this is an accurate representation of what is going on in two parts of the front lines: the Vremevka salient area, which is in the south, and in the Bakhmut area, which is further to the north. And this is what Pushilin said, and I'm taking this from TASS, though in fact he made these comments during a broadcast on Solovyov live television. At some point, the enemy even managed to gain foothold in the northern part of Uralzhainoye. Uralzhainoye is, of course, a village close to Staromayorsk. Staromayorsk is in the grey zone, but Ukraine has been trying to advance towards Uralzhainoye. They want to capture this village. If they can capture this village, they manage to get closer to the Surovikin line. In fact, they almost reach the Surovikin line, this elaborate, this massive fortification system which the Russians have created and which so far the Ukrainians have not been able to reach in any sector. But if they can capture Uralzhainoye, they are closer to reaching the Surovikin line. So to come back, Pushilin says at some point the enemy even managed to gain a foothold in the northern part of Uralzhainoye. Characteristically, combined assault teams from 4 Ukrainian army brigades were employed in this case. And we know that in fact there are 4 Ukrainian brigades operating in this area. And thanks to David Axe, we know that these are all Marine brigades. These are not exactly light infantry. They do have some armor, but they're not as heavily armored as some of the more heavy Ukrainian brigades, like, say, the 47th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, which has been conducting many of the attacks from the Orekhov sector. But the point is that these Marine brigades that are fighting in the Vremevka salient rather, are seen in Ukraine as elite infantry. And there's 3 to 4 of them. And the attack, which Pushilin is talking about, he's telling us that it was a combined attack by soldiers brought together, assault teams brought together from all of these Marine brigades. And the Russian Defense Ministry has been speaking about this for quite a long time now. They say that increasingly Ukraine is not attacking at brigade strength, or at least when attacks happen, they no longer happen from complete units drawn from individual brigades. Ukrainian brigades have suffered such heavy losses that in order to sustain attacks, Ukraine is having to bring together troops from different brigades in order to create effective assault teams. That's what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying. I'm not, as I've said many times, a person who knows much about these sort of things. It may be that there are other reasons why the Ukrainians might be drawing men from different brigades. That's something, as I said, with somebody with more military experience can touch on, but it's what the Russian Defense Ministry have been saying. And to me, as somebody who's not expert in this, it looks plausible. Anyway, that is what Pushilin said happened in this case. And then he says, in this case, armor was also employed, but as soon as the enemy gained a foothold in the northern part of Ura-Zhainoye, corresponding artillery and airstrikes were delivered against it. The enemy sustained casualties, whilst its military hardware remained on the spot, and it had to retreat to its previous positions. And then what Pushilin is telling us is that the attack was pressed forward, it gained a foothold in the village, but Russian airstrikes and artillery strikes eventually obliged the Ukrainians to pull back. And he said that some of the military hardware remained on the spot, which suggests, at least to me, and of course, again, this is Pushilin's account, so it might not be strictly accurate, but it suggests to me that the Ukrainians had to abandon some of their equipment. They had to leave it behind because they found it impossible to hold on to their positions. The Russian airstrikes and artillery strikes were too intense. And then Pushilin also discussed what happened in the nearby village of Staromayorsk. He says it cannot be said that we have improved our positions there, but the enemy has also failed to achieve success there. Such attempts occur regularly. And then Pushilin also tells us about what's going on near Artyomovsk, the city that Ukraine and most of the world continues to refer to as Bakhmut. And he says that there continues to be very heavy fighting around the village of Klashayevka. And he says Pushilin said it can't be said that the enemy has been completely driven out, but it is already hardly holding ground. Our fighters are doing well and are true heroes. Actually, nothing has remained of Klashayevka, and the entire ground there has been ploughed all over by shells from both our and the enemy's strikes. So there's still apparently a small force of Ukrainian troops clinging on to the northern tip of Klashayevka, but they're under heavy artillery attack. They can't really hold on, and Pushilin appears to expect that eventually they will be pushed back. And in fact, we've been hearing more reports that despite intense Ukrainian attempts to try to break through Russian defense lines around, Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, that Ukraine is not making any significant progress. The Russians continue to hold the village of Berkhovka to the north of Artyomovsk. I read an article in The Guardian which seemed, on the strength of something that Prigozhin said way back in June, to assume that Berkhovka is under Ukrainian control. It is still, in fact, under Russian control. Even The Guardian admitted that the Ukrainians are not making any real advances in the Bakhmut area, and we see that Pushilin is telling us the same thing. In fact, there have been reports of the Russians, in fact, counterattacking in this area. south of Kurdumovka and towards Andreevka, another village in this area, and that the Russians might even be pushing in some way closer to Ivanivska, another deserted village apparently in this area. There's been even a suggestion that the Ukrainians are being so heavily shelled in Ivanivska that they've actually pulled out their troops from there. I think that is unlikely, by the way. To be clear, Klesheyevka lies to the east of Ivanivska, and I would have thought that if the Russians are close to Ivanivska, as some reports claim, and the Ukrainians have had to pull out of Ivanivska, then the Ukrainian troops in Klesheyevka would hardly be able to hold out there. So I think those reports are probably inaccurate. But anyway, one gets a sense of a fluid battle, but one in which there have been no significant advances by the Ukrainians, which is in an area where the Ukrainians themselves have been trying to conduct an offensive ever since the beginning of May, an offensive which intensified after the capture of Bakhmut by the Russians at the end of May. So, deadlock on the Vremevka salient, Ukraine unable to consolidate control of Staromayorsk. Russians are not there either, but this area, this village is in the grey zone, and the Russians on the Vremevka ledge, Vremevka salient, holding on to Zhainoye, and in the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainians making no progress either. Incidentally, there have been more Russian missile and airstrikes, and they seem to have made a particularly heavy strike on Konstantinovka, which is a small town to the west of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. It's some distance behind the front lines. I remember reading that it was 13 kilometers from what was then still Bakhmut to the west of Bakhmut. And this small town appears to be the place where the Ukrainian military headquarters is located, and there appear to have been more missile and airstrikes on this town, presumably on that headquarters, suggesting that the Russians are trying, to the extent that they can, to disrupt Ukrainian command and control systems there. So Pushilin has given us an overview, and from all other sources that I've been able to see, this time rather accurate overview, suggesting that in these two places, on the Vremevka ledge and in the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainian offensive, in effect, is at a stop. Now, there have been more Ukrainian attacks in the Rabotina area, towards from Orekhov. Again, all the indications are, all the reports coming together say the same thing. All of these attacks now carried out by light infantry principally. We're not seeing the great armoured advances that we've seen at other points during this offensive. These are infantry assaults, Ukrainian infantry trying to advance in small groups towards the Russian lines, trying to cross the minefields. Ukrainian soldiers crossing those minefields, often being severely injured. The level of amputations suffered by the Ukrainian military is becoming horrific and is apparently now surpassing in absolute numbers amputations experienced by the British military over the course of the First World War. and it is largely because of these attempts to cross these minefields on foot that is happening. But anyway, Ukrainian infantry trying to dash across these minefields towards the Russian defences, suffering horrific losses, attempting to do that, getting shelled as they approach. There's no word so far of the Russians using cluster munitions, but they previously said that if Ukraine did use cluster munitions, they reserve the right to do the same. It's not impossible that they are using them. I've just seen no reports to that effect. But I would have thought that used cluster munitions, if the Russians are using them, targeting dispersed infantry, trying to cross open fields to storm Russian positions. It's almost exactly what cluster munitions were designed to do. One has to say that in the event that they are being used, the combination of cluster munitions and mines must make the fighting for the Ukrainian soldiers who are unfortunate enough to be committed to these attacks absolutely horrendous, and the casualty levels must be simply appalling. And one must imagine steppe lands with large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers severely wounded, bodies of soldiers in many places. The images that must be coming out of these fields after each one of these attacks must be horrendous, though I understand that both sides still observe the practice of allowing local ceasefires so that the wounded can be collected. But anyway, more of these Ukrainian attacks, and I gather that they have been unsuccessful. Once again, they've been repulsed everywhere that they've tried these attacks, and that the results of these attacks have simply been more Ukrainian soldiers killed and more Ukrainian soldiers injured. Now, there was a rather intriguing report on the Russian Redovka website, which said that the Ukrainians may be starting to despair of frontal assaults on the Russian positions around Rabotino, and that they try to attack in various places. Redovka makes it clear that none of these attacks were successful, but it speaks of Ukrainian troops being shifted around the front lines like kind of fire brigade, sent from one place to another, hitting Russian positions, being pushed back and failing in what they try to do. Now, if this is correct and this is what is indeed happening, then that might point to increasing Ukrainian losses in this area, to the fact that if the Ukrainians are having to shuffle units around in that way, perhaps they're running out of men and units that they can use in that kind of fashion. But I have to say that the Redovka report was very vague and sketchy. It didn't provide much in the way of detail, so I would place it as low on the index of reliability. However, Redovka does have some quite, well-informed sources, so it may be that this is true, and if it is true, it suggests that it would provide further reason to think that this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, is starting to run down. Anyway, that's what seems to have been happening on the southern front lines. Vladimir Putin has conferred upon one of the Russian regiments that has been defending Rabotino the title of Guards. It's now become a Guards regiment. This is an honorific. It's a kind of way of commending the soldiers in this regiment. elevating their status. It's essentially a recognition of their success in defending Rabotina against these sort of attacks. And there's also been some further news of a Russian airstrike on Orechov itself. And the interesting part of the news here is that this does appear to have been an airstrike. So it was carried out presumably by a Sukhoi 34, and apparently a precision-guided bomb was used. And there are Russian reports, which one cannot confirm, but there are Russian reports that the building that was struck was the headquarters of the 47th Mechanized Infantry Brigade of Ukraine's army. Now, the 47th Mechanized Infantry Brigade is one of the 9 brigades that was trained by the West. It was the brigade that was originally equipped with the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It has been involved in the fighting continuously, the offensive continuously, since it began on the 4th of June. It is the brigade that has been leading the mechanized attacks south of Orechov towards Rabotina. It is a brigade which has suffered very severe losses by all accounts, that's had to be pulled back on occasion, that has had to receive reinforcements from newly called up reservists, which of course dilute its original quality. But anyway, it continues to be one of the centerpieces of the Ukrainian forces undertaking this offensive. And of course, the headquarters will presumably have been staffed by officers who have been trained in the West. Now, the first thing to say is I can't confirm that this airstrike did take place and that it really did hit this headquarters. But if it did, then presumably some of these officers were killed. But anyway, the word is, at least this is from the Russian sources, that the airstrike on the headquarters has disrupted the control and coordination of this brigade. Well, as I said, that was a report. Perhaps the most interesting part of the report is that Russian aircraft are apparently able now, feel confident enough now to launch these airstrikes on Ukrainian positions. Apparently, they're no longer so intimidated by Ukrainian air defenses anymore. That's, of course, assuming that the airstrike took place, which I have to say, I think it probably did. Whether it was as effective as the Russians are claiming, that is another matter. That is something that I can't confirm. Anyway, so that's the situation in terms of Ukraine's offensive. There doesn't seem to be any progress made, more losses every day, a situation where Ukraine is basically banging its head against a steel wall, and its head is becoming increasingly blooded as a result of its attempting to do this. But all of this is now overshadowed by the news from the north. And we have had a number of reports from various Russian sources, and the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, has also provided us with some information. And I'm going to start firstly with their bulletin, their progress on their report of the progress of what is actually happening. And they say in the Kupiansk direction, that's in the north, in the course of conducting offensive operations assault detachments of the Zapad group of forces, that's the West group of forces. The force improved the situation along the front line. 7 counterattacks by 14th and 44th Mechanized Brigades of the Ukrainian military have been repelled close to Novozyolofskoye. This is that village that the Russians captured a few days ago. Sinkovka and Mankovka, which are both in Kharkiv region. And then we go on to read that the enemy losses were up to 55 Ukrainian servicemen, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 3 motor vehicles, 1 M109 Paladin self-propelled artillery system, and 1 US-manufactured M777 artillery system. So that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying to us. And the important place name mentioned here is Sinkovka, or Sinkovka. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Somebody will no doubt inform me fairly soon. Well, that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense says. It's, as always, a very bland and in some ways rather uninformative bulletin. There were previously reports that 2 Ukrainian brigades had been rushed to the area to stem the Russian advances. This identifies them, this bulletin identifies them as the 14th and 44th Mechanized Brigades. A mechanized brigade, in terms of the Ukrainian military, is one of the heavier brigades. It's one of the better equipped brigades with the younger and better trained troops. These are, to the extent that one can say that Ukraine has strong brigades any longer, these are 2 strong brigades that Ukraine has rushed to the area. But in the event, the Russian Defense Ministry claims that the attacks, these counterattacks, these attempts to stem the Russian advance in this area were unsuccessful. So it's a bland report, but it does give us some information. Then we've had some more information, also this time from the Ukrainians themselves. And we learn that the authorities in the Kupiansk district of Ukraine have now ordered a mandatory evacuation of civilians to safe areas. And the order was issued by Andrei Kanashevich, who is the head of the Kupiansk district military administration, and he's given instructions that local residents should leave, and local residents who refuse to leave, that they have the option to refuse to leave, but he says this: it's not a forced evacuation, but a mandatory one. People can formally refuse to be evacuated. Had it been a forced evacuation, there would be no option to refuse, but that the situation on the front lines is now extremely dangerous. And we learn that another Ukrainian official, Oleg Sinyegubov, has now said that the authorities are considering the possibility of announcing a mandatory evacuation for over 11,000 people from the frontline areas of the Kupiansk district. And that's not just in the Kupiansk area that the Ukrainian situation appears to be deteriorating, because we also learn, now I'm going back to the Russian Defense Ministry, that they're advancing in other places on the northern front lines. They say that in the Krasny Liman direction there was an attempted counterattack by the Ukrainian Army's 21st Mechanized Brigade, but that this was unsuccessful, and that the forces of Battle Group Center, this is the battle group which is commanded by General Podvierchev, airstrikes and artillery fire defeated them, that Ukraine lost 60 men, 3 armored combat vehicles, Star B howitzer, and Akatsiya motorized artillery system. And anyway, the Russians are continuing to advance in this area, in the Liman direction as well. But the key is what is going on in this village of Sinkovka, because there are some reports that say that the Russians have entered it, other reports that they're close to entering it, reports that the Ukrainian troops in Sinkovka have been forced to withdraw, but that it's still in the grey zone, others that it remains contested. But there does seem to be heavy fighting going on in this particular area in Sinkovka for this particular village. And if you go to the maps, and as I've said, I'm not great at reading maps, well, Sinkovka is so close to Kupiansk that it is, to all intents and purposes, a suburb of Kupiansk. If Ukraine loses Sinkovka, if the Russians capture Sinkovka, then it seems to me that one would be justified in saying that the Russian assault on Kupiansk has all but begun. It suggests that we are very close to that point indeed now, and the fact that the Ukrainians are now asking people to evacuate, that they are starting to contemplate evacuations, well, that points clearly to a critical situation starting to emerge for Ukraine on the northern front lines. And the point that's been made now by several commentators is that what has happened is that by concentrating so many of its troops along the southern front lines, in the Zaporozhye and Kherson region, by launching these offensives towards Pyatikhatki, Rabotino, on the Vremivka salient area, towards Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have stripped the northern front lines of sufficient troops to be able to hold their positions effectively. There's been no attempts to harden the front lines with fortifications, that the Russians have been carefully and incrementally advancing, taking advantage of this. But there are now some reports that suggest that the Russians have concluded, after several weeks of conducting these advances, that Ukrainian positions in the north are as weak as they appear to be, that there is no real reserves available for Ukraine here, and in light of this, that the Russians are now preparing to move from what has been a very cautious, incremental offensive up to this point towards a full-on offensive, a storming of Kupiansk, perhaps an attempt to push west beyond Kupiansk and the Oskol River to take advantage of the weakness of the Ukrainian positions. Now, if that does happen, if that is indeed what happens, if Kupiansk is recaptured by the Russians, about a year after the Russians abandoned it, in fact, just under a year after the Russians abandoned it, over the course of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive, if the Russians are able to push even further west towards ETHEREUM, perhaps even recapturing ETHEREUM. Well, I have already discussed in previous programs that this would be a hammer blow for Ukraine. It would mean that the one clear-cut victory that Ukraine has achieved over the course of this war in the offensive that took place in Kharkiv region in September of last year, that clear-cut victory has been reversed. It was a victory achieved following extraordinarily high losses, despite the fact that Russian defenses in Kharkiv region were very, very weak, and that the Russians, in fact, appear to have been already contemplating a possibility of withdrawing from that area because they weren't able to man it with sufficient troops to hold the Ukrainians back. But nonetheless, in spite of all of that, it was a victory. If the Russians return, if they're able to recapture Kupiansk and ETHEREUM, and conceivably even battle on and reach Balakleia, well, it will put Ukrainian positions to the south in places like Liman and Siversk in a very great jeopardy. But beyond that, the reversal of this victory will, at a time when Ukraine had been expecting gains as a result of its own offensive, will come as a psychological shock in Kiev, amongst the wider Ukrainian population, and I suspect also amongst Western governments. It will be the moment when it is no longer possible to deny the truth that the offensive has failed, and that it is Ukraine, not Russia, that is both retreating and is in fact losing the war. So, what does Ukraine do? Well, I'm going to go back to that article, that outstanding article written by George Beebe and Jim Webb, which appeared in Time magazine a short time ago. To remind again, George Beebe and Jim Webb are both members, fellows of the Quincy Institute, which is one of the few places where you can find rational discussions of this conflict and cause for not just restraint, but for a complete change in the way in which the United States conducts foreign policy, and specifically foreign policy in connection with this particular conflict. Its website, Responsible Statecraft, is one of the go-to places, in my opinion, for both analysis and criticism of current US foreign policy. But anyway, George Beebe and Jim Webb, they also have their different backgrounds. They co-wrote that article. George Beebe, I understand his strengths are in diplomacy and in intelligence analysis. He has a background in studying and analyzing Russian intelligence matters. Jim Webb, military man, a person who served in the infantry. He has a soldier's eye. And they produced what I consider, and I've said this I think previously, to have been one of the finest articles about the conflict that has been published anywhere in the US up to this point. And they've come to the logical conclusion, and they did so about, well, that article appeared from memory about 10 days ago. Anyway, their point was this: the Ukrainian offensive is not succeeding. This is becoming increasingly obvious. Everybody can see it. There's this pretense that eventually something might turn up, the Russians might panic, they might run out of reserves, increasingly unlikely, but we still hear people talking that way. They might run out of ammunition. No sign of that at the moment. But there's this continued faith-based, because that's what it is, hope that the offensive might somehow come right, but it's not borne out by evidence on the ground. One can't decide issues of war and peace based purely on hope. One has to look at the realities. The realities is that the offensive is not succeeding. It's inflicting upon Ukraine appalling casualties. The casualties that Ukraine is incurring as a result of it persisting with this offensive are compromising Ukraine's future ability to defend itself. What Ukraine needs to do is to recognize the military realities, pull back, call the offensive off, cede, if it must, some ground to the Russians, build up its own fortified lines, its own defense lines, try to hold the Russians back, and of course, all of this in the context of this enormous Russian build-up that is going on, but try and hold the Russians back, make things more difficult for the Russians, in other words, going forward, and then use the time and space that this achieves to initiate negotiations. Now, what we've seen ever since that article appeared is vindication of the arguments that George Beebe and Jim Webb have been making. The offensive has been persisted with, contrary to their advice. Yesterday, I discussed this article that has now appeared in CNN, in which we have all those, our old friends, the anonymous officials, anonymous US officials, anonymous Western officials. They tell us that the West has now largely lost hope of a breakthrough in this offensive. That, maybe, just possibly, something might come right, but Ukraine hasn't broken through the first of the Russian defense lines. There's other defense lines beyond the first defense lines. There's an article also in the Wall Street Journal which admits that Ukraine hasn't even properly reached the first defense line of the Surovikin line. But regardless, it hasn't broken through any one of the Russian defense lines. It's still fighting where it ought to have broken through much earlier in the offensive, if the offensive was going to succeed. It hasn't broken through, it's stuck, it suffered enormous losses. The Russians claim 42,000 men killed or taken prisoner. That might be an overstatement. I mean, it could be more than that, but we're seeing, as I said, verifiable numbers now of thousands of men, Ukrainian soldiers, suffering terrible wounds with limbs amputated. We see admissions from in many places that large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers have been wounded and killed in the fighting. The Western media is reporting all of this. We also learn about the depletion of Ukraine's military stocks. A short while ago, it was admitted that a fifth of all the military equipment that had been supplied by the West, the tanks, the Bradleys, the Strykers, has been lost. The Russians are now putting that figure higher. They say that it's a third of the total amount of such equipment has now been lost. So, and of course, these perennial problems of shells, the Ukrainians increasingly now are having to use cluster munitions. I read a Russian report which said that Ukraine, 2/3 of the shells that Ukraine is firing now are cluster munitions. Only a third are unitary munitions. Even though a number of people who understand about war, who've operated with these kind of weapons, people like Colonel McGregor, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, Scott Ritter, they've all said the same thing, that cluster munitions are not really effective for the kind of offensive that Ukraine is trying to undertake. So everything that Beebe and Webb said is coming true. Ukraine is suffering heavy losses, it's not making progress, it's depleting its future ability to conduct a defense once this offensive has run its course. And we are seeing some of these effects now starting to play out. Not only is the offensive itself in the south and eastern front lines losing momentum, but we see that on the northern front lines, Ukrainian defences have become so threadbare that what I still suspect is a relatively small Russian force, but probably a relatively fresh and freshly equipped Russian force has been able to make significant progress and now appears to be either at the gates of Kupiansk or very close to the gates of Kupiansk, to the point where Ukraine is now having to evacuate civilians from the area, from that particular area. So, call off the offensive. Do what Beebe and Webb advised. Accept that the offensive has failed. Formally admit this. It's better, in my opinion. This is, in my opinion, what Ukraine should do. I understand that in the United States, in Britain, in Germany as well, they might not be too happy if there's an open admission to that effect, but it's always, it seems to me, better to admit to one's soldiers when things are not working out and why the offensive has been called off. Admit that the offensive cannot be continued, that it's failed. Call it off. Be frank with your men and with your civilian population. Pull Ukrainian troops back. Decide where the best fortified lines can be. Deploy your engineers to create them. You don't have the time. There isn't the time to do so to the level of sophistication that the Russians have achieved in terms of their own fortified lines, but Ukraine has shown an ability to create fortified lines of its own at speed. There's some reports that they're trying to build some kind of a ditch in front of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Pull back to these defendable places and then recognize finally the truth that Ukraine cannot defeat Russia. Western support, military support, is not the solution to Ukraine's problem. It's only prolonging the war, causing Ukraine to incur further losses. Put aside, disregard the bad advice that's coming from the West and open negotiations with Moscow. Now, I've already said that the Russians might be very unwilling to entertain such negotiations, that there is an available mediator who might be prepared to step in, who is Li Hui, and that's perhaps the right thing to do. Will Ukraine do it? Well, of course it won't, and this is the great tragedy of this war. The Ukrainian government has, to all intents and purposes now, completely boxed itself in. I've just done a program recently with Dmitry Symes Jr. You can find it on YouTube, in which we discussed the prospect for negotiations. I went through a long catalogue of the problems with negotiations. And I also said that, unfortunately, the reality is that Ukraine itself has ruled out negotiations, and it's ruled them out in such a dogmatic and extreme way. It continues to make such extraordinary maximalist demands of the Russians that if the Ukrainian government were to do the things that I said, well, it would undoubtedly provoke a political crisis in Ukraine. The government itself would probably split. There might be, for all I know, an internal coup launched against, or a purge launched against any officials within that government, up to and including President Zelensky himself, who support such negotiations. So there is no realistic chance of Ukraine doing the things that I've said, at least not the negotiating part of the formula. But Western governments, or so it seems to me, do perhaps have some room for manoeuvre. And I appreciate and understand that Western leaders, Western presidents and prime ministers and those people are now so committed to this conflict that it's going to be very difficult for them either to talk about negotiations. But they might at least follow the advice of Beeb and Webb and tell the Ukrainians, call this offensive off. It's not succeeding. Pull back, build up your fortified lines. Let's see if we can find some mechanism to freeze the conflict. Perhaps, just possibly, if it's just left to that, the Ukrainians might follow that advice. I have to say that there would still be profound implications from this. The Western powers giving Ukraine that sort of advice would be the Western powers conceding that Ukraine is not going to recover all of its territory and that it cannot win the war against Russia. That fantasies of retaking Crimea are just that, fantasies. And that might be a very difficult thing for some people in the West to do. But it is, it seems to me, the obvious thing to do. If you accept, if you acknowledge that there is not going to be a breakthrough in the offensive, and that's what that CNN article was telling us yesterday, then logically you're accepting that the offensive has failed. If the offensive has failed, then forget about restarting it in the autumn or the winter. It's not going to be any more successful then than it has been up to now. The logic, all the logic, points to following the advice that Beeb and Webb outlined in that article. Will Western governments do this? Well, they should, and I suspect there are going to be some people in the Pentagon especially, and in the Council for Foreign Relations who will be arguing for it. But again, I have to say, I am far from confident that this now obvious course is the one that is going to be followed. It seems to me, once more, that the President of the United States and his advisors and his foreign policy team, Blinken and Nuland and Sullivan, are now so overinvested in this project that any failure and an admission of the failure of the offensive would be such a failure, would be seen as such a failure, admitting to such a failure. Any failure is now impossible. It would be very difficult for them to agree to this, to decide this, and I doubt that they're going to do it. I think that they would worry that if they did give Ukraine that kind of advice, they would open themselves up actually to more criticism than they're prepared to accept. So, all the indications are that the advice of Beebe and Webb will not be followed, compelling though it has now become, unarguable to my mind as it has now become, and that we will still see this offensive persisted in. We will continue to get these disastrous attacks on Rabotino and other places, these attempts to move forward in the Vremivka salient area, more attacks in the Bakhmut area, even as the Russians press forward, recapture Kupiansk, as they're increasingly likely to do, perhaps push further west towards ETHEREUM, with all the appalling psychological effect on Ukraine that causes. There will be no attempt to try to shift the course of the battlefield, and the entire strategy, such as it will be to wait, to keep on attacking in the south and the east until the rains come and the Rasputitsa, the mud season, starts, and then you can let it ebb away and move on to the next topic. And as to what that next topic is going to be, well, we see growing signs of this. We see that the President of the United States, President Biden, is now apparently contemplating a trip to Vietnam, where he's going to make another of the unending attempts to try to win over the leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party, which the United States fought so bitterly in the 1960s and the 1970s, to try to win over the Vietnamese Communist Party, their leaders, to some kind of joint alliance against China. A hopeless idea, in my opinion. We also see that the President has now just authorized again more restrictions on US investment in China, trying to limit investments in Chinese technology sector, trying to, in effect, contain China technologically, even as I suspect increasingly the focus starts to switch towards China again. This, even as the Chinese and the US have been trying to press forward. I've been talking about setting up these working parties, even as this talk that these working parties that were the one result of Secretary Blinken's visit to Beijing a few weeks ago, even as these working parties start to work and try to do whatever it is that they can do. And I can't help but think that even just a few weeks after the United States was trying to improve relations with China, or at least to stabilize relations with China, we are going to see before long relations with China begin to deteriorate again. And of course, there's talk now of the United States actually the president making direct grants of arms supplies to Taiwan, even as, by the way, I get the sense that the mood in Taiwan itself is shifting away from the policy of confronting China. The government itself might be committed, the government of Taiwan might be committed to that policy, but increasing numbers of people in Taiwan are becoming nervous and skeptical about it, and there are some indications that the Kuomintang party, which wants to restore relations with China, might be heading for a victory in the elections in Taiwan, which are due to take place, or so I understand, in October. So anyway, we will see what happens, but that might be the plan, if one can even call it a plan. Think less, talk less about Ukraine, continue to supply them with some weapons, some machines, trying to keep the war going. Let the story fade away, difficult though that might be. Focus instead on China. Focus to some extent on West Africa. I find it fascinating that the leaders of the State Department, Blinken and Nuland, have been devoting all this time to a crisis in a place like Niger. But there we are. Try to move the discussion, in other words, move the attention onto other issues. Keep your fingers crossed that there isn't going to be a collapse in Ukraine before the November elections. And take no step that might be in any way controversial, like telling Ukraine to switch from the offence to the defence, controversial, and which in that case might be construed as admitting to a defeat, or beginning negotiations with the Russians, meaningful negotiations with the Russians, which might be more controversial still. So that's, it seems to me, the dismal prospect we are looking at, even as people die and even as Ukraine bleeds away. Now, perhaps over the course of this program, I've devoted too much time to the article by Webb and Beebe, given that I'm afraid I doubt that their advice is going to be followed. But I don't actually think that is the case, because I think that it is important always to remember what has been true throughout this Ukrainian conflict from the outset, which is that at every point there have been choices. There were choices going all the way back before the Orange Revolution of 2004 to leave the situation in Ukraine alone. The West intervened. It supported the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. In 2008, it made the disastrous decision, despite advice from even people like William Burns, the US ambassador to Moscow, who is now, of course, the CIA director, that inviting Ukraine into NATO was something that Russia was certain to absolutely reject and oppose. And then, of course, there was the option at the time when President Yanukovych decided that he would need to renegotiate the association agreement with the EU in order to facilitate and maintain trade with Russia. There was the option of engaging Ukraine and Russia in those kind of trade negotiations. That was what was offered in 2013, but again, the United States and the Europeans didn't take that option. They wanted instead the entire association agreement as it was to remain unchanged. I remember they said that they weren't prepared to change even a punctuation mark in the text. Instead, they supported protests, sometimes violent protests, that eventually caused President Yanukovych's fall, and which to some extent, at least to a very great extent, in fact, they not only supported, but actually, in my opinion, organised. But that's a more controversial question. Anyway, they then supported the Ukrainian government in its decision, the new Ukrainian government, the installed Ukrainian government, in its decision to launch what it called an anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine when protests against the change of government in Kiev broke out there. This despite the fact that the Russians at that time were encouraging negotiations, that the then Secretary of State, John Kerry, actually agreed with the Russians that a federalized solution for Ukraine might be the optimal way forward. But all that was thrown aside, and the West supported Ukraine's military attack on the people in the Donbass, who up to that point were willing to engage Ukraine in negotiations. And that military attack miscarried, and then there was Minsk I, and then there was Minsk II, and the West could have got behind both of those agreements and insisted that Ukraine implement the terms of those agreements. But of course, it didn't do that. And then there was the crisis, the diplomatic crisis in late 2021, early 2022, when the Russians proposed their draft treaties, again making it clear that Ukraine's entry into NATO was unacceptable. But of course, the West refused to negotiate about that either. They insisted that the principle, the so-called open door principle, which doesn't exist for NATO membership, was sacrosanct and could not be negotiated with or bargained with. They weren't even prepared to make, as it now turns out, basic concessions about agreements on non-deployment of US forces, including missile forces in Ukraine. They were prepared to discuss this informally, but they weren't prepared to agree to a legally bound text concerning any of these things. And then in the meetings just before the start of the conflict, meetings between Ukraine and the so-called involving Ukraine in the so-called contact group, they backed Ukraine as it again refused to implement the Minsk agreements by negotiating with the leaders of the Donbass, which it was required to do by the Minsk agreement. They looked the other way. Shelling from Ukraine intensified. And then when the conflict began, when Ukraine and Russia almost came to terms through a series of negotiations which took place in Belarus and which took place in Istanbul, they sabotaged those agreements in a sequence of steps in which the United States, the Western powers, have always taken the line of conflict instead of the line of potential compromise. And now we are at another fork in the road. They can again consider at least the option discussed and put forward by Webb and Beeb. They can tell Ukraine, right, our offensive has failed, pull back, set up fortified lines, try and negotiate with the Russians, hold them back. They may be getting stronger, but if you can create fortified lines, that might slow the Russians down, and that might create doubts in Moscow and perhaps push people there towards negotiations. And who knows, in that kind of environment, it might be that the international opinion might shift in favor of negotiations. Also, perhaps China and India might press you to negotiations, might press the Russians to agree to negotiations as well. I predict that, like all the other forks in the road, the West, the United States, will take the wrong one. But let it never be said that it took that wrong turn without advice about the better course that it might have followed. That article by Beeb and Webb is there. Everyone can read it. Lincoln, Sullivan, Leland, the President himself, you can all read it. They can also see what it says. I don't expect that they will follow the advice that this is there, but never let it be said that the United States didn't have choices and that it didn't always choose the wrong ones. Thank you very much for joining me today for this program. More from me soon. Tomorrow, I should say, today and tomorrow, we have the meeting of the ECOWAS group. We'll see what they decide to do in connection with the, I suppose you could call it a crisis in Niger, though I understand the situation there is quite peaceful and stable at the moment. But anyway, we will see what comes of that, and I will attempt to cover it in my next program. I should say that it is not absolutely certain that I will be able to make this program tomorrow. I'm committed to various things, private matters, but I will nonetheless endeavour to do so. And if I do make a program and it's made before the decisions of ECOWAS are known, well, I will obviously catch up and deal with that over the course of the next few days. In the meantime, all that remains for me, once more, is to wish you all a very good day, to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, which with its magic mugs, its hats, its hoodies, its t-shirts, its v-neck shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.